I'd like to introduce Dr. Lynn Rothschild, and she's an evolutionary biologist and astrobiologist at NASA Ames. She's also a professor at Stanford and Brown. She's a fellow of the Linnean Society of London and the California Academy of Sciences. Dr. Rothschild.
Thank you, that's lovely, but that was my last slide, actually, which means that we go into the break much sooner, I suppose. Great. I've been sitting there in the audience trying to figure out exactly how to start this, and actually I've been spending the last several months since Dorian emailed me in Brazil trying to figure out exactly why I'm here. I don't have wonderful stories like so many other people here of, having been Lynn's student or colleague or published papers with her. I don't even remember when I actually met her. I knew she existed, and then somehow I knew her. The only other thing that I can think of is that, oddly enough, even though there's supposed to be phylogenetic information inherent in your name, over the years there were a lot of people who confused the two of us simply because we had the name Lynn. And I never quite understood why, because I would think that I'm too young to actually be physically confused with her, and I'm too old to have been named after her. So here I am, the other Lynn, for want of a better reason. What I thought I would do instead is sort of show you partly some of the parallels in our interests, which is probably why we did know each other better than you would have thought, considering we spent very, very little time together. To give you an idea, I've been telling some people a story since she died. I hadn't seen her probably in 5 or 10 years, and we were at a meeting at Woods Hole a few years ago. And I saw her in the cafeteria, and I walked up to her, and like I'm sure everyone else in this room would do, I said, "Hi, Lynn, it's nice to see you." And she looks at me and says, "I hear you're leaving Friday night. Change your plane." Like, okay, Lynn. And it turns out it's because her talk was Saturday, and she said, "I want your feedback. You've got to be here." So, of course, I changed my plane. Anyway, I use this slide a lot, but I think Lynn would have enjoyed using it as well. So I think I'm here partly to carry the astrobiology banner, so I'll sort of do that and then go off a little bit on a protistan tangent and then get back to it. And I'm sure virtually everybody in this room now knows that astrobiology is 3 basic sound bites. Where do we come from, all the way back, not just to the gorillas or the protists. Frankly, I'd be happy never to hear the word protoctiste again, but Lynn knew that I said that, so it's okay to say it. I'm not saying it behind her back. Where do we come from, all the way back perhaps to the Big Bang, so the whole planetary context that you've heard about. Where are we going, which in some ways is the mirror image, and if we don't know something about our past, how can we hypothesize and take control over our future? Because that really should be the most important part of this trilogy of astrobiology, with the exception of having little green men land on the lawn right here in Amherst, the "Are we alone" part, which is what, of course, fascinates the public. And we forget, because she wasn't ever a NASA official or anything like that, that Lynn actually had enormous influence on the founding of the field of astrobiology. And here's a picture that I was sure John was going to use, but fortunately he didn't, because there you can see him standing right next to Lynn. This was at the Astrobiology 50th anniversary meeting, a little over a year ago in Washington, and you can see there's Lynn between John and Dan Golden, the former administrator. There's Barry Blumberg way over on the left, who has also very sadly passed away. And sort of in the spirit of another sort of amusing Lynn story, but very typical. My relationship with her is when she got, I guess it's the National Medal of Science. We had been talking about Barry. We were at some reception, probably a couple of glasses of wine in, and I said, I sort of was drifting, and she told me about this award, and I said, "Oh, he'll be so pleased, after the Nobel," or, whatever. And she just looked at me and she said, "No, I got it, you idiot." She just pulls me up by the collar. Sorry, Lynn. So anyway, astrobiology, really is what makes us be able to interpret evolution. And again, this is something that I think Lynn understood at a gut level very early on, that you have to understand something about the environment as well. So here's just another sort of beautiful colored phylogenetic tree of all of life in a little different format than the others you've seen. And what is known is that some of the earliest organisms to tree out are thermophiles, organisms that live at very high temperatures. And of course, we could hypothesize that life arose in very high temperatures. But then when you start bringing the physical environment in, we also know that the late heavy bombardment period occurred from about 4.2 to 3.8 billion years ago. And so it could very well have acted as an environmental filter. And thus, the reason we see thermophiles and hyperthermophiles way back in these molecular trees may well be because they're the ones that made it through the late heavy bombardment and therefore are the last common ancestor for life on Earth. So there's my representation of the late heavy bombardment. And so sort of with all due respect to Dobzhansky, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, I'd like to say that in fact it really is nothing in evolution makes sense except in the light of astrobiology. And in fact, again, this is something that Lynn was well aware of. Here is sort of my take on the evolution of life on Earth over the last 4.6 billion years ago. And of course, if you don't throw in things like continental drift and so on, it is in some ways meaningless, or at least you've purposely ignored a lot of the explanatory power. This has not been, overly popular for the last 150, 200 years, but is now sort of gaining back favor, I think, because it's absolutely critical to understand the two together. So what I'd like to do now for a few minutes is take a few slides that I use in my class. I teach astrobiology and space exploration at Stanford, which I've been doing for a dozen or so years, and we have a website, astrobiology.stanford.edu, and we've been able to get a little bit of Lynn's interviews for this. Anyway, one of the lectures that I give is fancifully called Great Moments in Evolution. Turns out when you Google that, you end up with mostly Gary Larson cartoons. But what I've done is sort of distill sort of 8 real areas that I think were critical to the evolution of life on Earth. And when I started looking at it, I realized that, in fact, out of that, there are quite a few that Lynn has really made major contributions to the study. Of course, microbial world and understanding the origin of photosynthesis, aerobic metabolism, if you include the mitochondrial work, origin of genetic novelty sex, symbiosis and the origin of eukaryotes. That's obviously a no-brainer. She may well have done work on multicellularity, transition of land intelligence, and viruses, but I'm not aware of that. And so what I thought I'd do is focus just a moment or two on 2 of those, starting with the symbiosis and the origin of eukaryotes, just sort of, again, to remind you of some of her contributions that, you sit there as the last speaker in a session hoping every moment that the next slide isn't going to take away from what you were going to say, and I don't think we are here. I think everyone here knows that the very first eukaryotes were protists. They're ancestors to us all. No one has actually mentioned, I think, that Lynn, along with Max Taylor, was the co-founder of the International Society of Evolutionary Protistology, ISEP, which is a marvelous society that meets every few years, still does. It has that sort of Rambo feel to it, the rubber brick that's thrown at a particularly poor or a particularly, insightful talk or bad joke, and so on. So that was yet another one of her contributions. Of course, she was well aware of the fact that protists are not little plants and they're not little animals, but in fact, plants and animals are protist descendants. And that's critical because you're never going to get nomenclature or, in fact, your views of evolution right if you don't realize that that's the way things worked. And so being sort of a radical grad student, in the 80s, I published a couple of papers with Peter Haywood at Brown University suggesting that maybe there should be 17 groups of eukaryotes set up, reconciliation of evolution nomenclature among the higher taxa of protists, and protista nomenclature, analysis and refutation. And darn it, Lynn and Dorian at the same time published exactly the same thing. I think we had a month or 2 priority, but I thought it was actually great that she was thinking very much in the same lines, so we were very much consistent on that. I threw this in just in case there was anyone, from the back of the room, or maybe the gentleman pulling out the plates who was not aware of the endosymbiosis hypothesis that, that she obviously popularized, advanced, and, and one of those things that's been left unsaid is that people didn't go out and do research to support the endosymbiotic hypothesis as much as there were an awful lot of people who simply wanted to prove her wrong. And that was even better because by doing so, they proved her right. And so, in a way, she had the intellectual revenge, which I think she enjoyed. Of course, there is the whole primary host thing, and you get a cyanobacterium that is just simply is followed, an alpha proteobacterium, and you end up with your basic stripped down red alga or green alga, and then you can have all sorts of other fun things, Russian doll sort of effects where you get secondary hosts and nucleomorphs, and you end up with cryptomonads and diatoms and so on. And we're all aware that she got, many medals for this because it really probably would have eventually been revealed. I know Peter Gogarden's in the room. His work and others would eventually, I think, have shown the same thing. But it was there as a hypothesis much earlier, and the ultrastructural evidence was being built up and so on. And so is really beautiful the way it happened. I make sure that my students know at least who the person on the left is. Increasingly, they don't even know who the person on the right is. But at least they know the person on the left. And in fact, this has gone much further. I'm sorry Jim Lake isn't here because I always cite two of his papers that, in fact, he has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic nucleus itself is a product of genome fusion. So in a way, symbiosis. Same sort of idea, and in fact, he's also suggested that prokaryotic taxa may have also have arisen by endosymbiosis. So let's switch over to the other one here that I want to highlight, and that's the origin of genetic novelty, sex. And many of you are asking the question, why bother with sex? I find this is the one time my students perk up all semester. And yes, that is an X-rated micrograph of two ciliates. I did not actually take the picture, but it's marvelous. You just don't catch them in the act that often. Anyway, sex, is the sort of the party line is that sex is there to create variation in novel environments. But this is, yes, it's true, but it's sort of a little bit of a chicken and egg. What's a less well-known hypothesis, and I think, well, I know that Lynn also subscribed to, is that sex is a way to overcome deleterious mutations. So if you're living in an environment with, for example, high ultraviolet radiation, which we both have published on, and you're starting to pick up mutations and you don't have some sort of sexual process, your progeny have your mutations plus a few they pick up themselves, and then their offspring have more and more, and so you're ratcheting down, you're in big trouble. But if, say, there's some sort of sexual interchange with another organism, and I have one gene that's bad and my husband's got another gene or two that's bad, but they're different ones, we have a chance of having offspring that are darn near perfect like my children, or at least they're now genetically reset. And there is some experimental evidence for that, and again, it's something that I found that Lynn actually had published a bit on quite a while ago, and it's a tremendously interesting idea, and hopefully there'll be more research on that. And then, darn it, turns out she'd not only been interested in it, she'd published 2 books on sex. And I say my oldest is a sophomore studying biology, but I'm not quite sure I'm at the point that I'd be ready to publish books on sex with my own son. But hats off to Lynn and Dorian, wonderful work. So that sort of brings us back to the whole astrobiology, the final frontier. And as you can see, she made all sorts of contributions in this whole question, where do we come from? And certainly contributions in the where are we going with her work on Gaia and so on. But the astrobiology part, the are we alone, I think she made contributions that perhaps she didn't even realize that are going to be going into the future. And that is really less of specific papers and discoveries and more of a way of thinking. So this question, are we alone, I see that it relies on sort of 4 points. The first is that we actually only have one data point for life in the universe at this point, and that's planet Earth. And so the more that you understand about the processes that went on here, the better we have a chance of understanding what the possible is elsewhere. And really, it's these oddities and the limits that give the minimum envelope for life on the Earth. And so going into an extreme environment like high temperature or low pH or high salt or whatever gives us a minimum envelope for life. So that if we go to some place like, this is for David, Venus or something, and you find a boiling acid hot spring. Obviously, Venus is way, way too hot today. It's the hottest planetary surface in our solar system. But, you know, say you were going there a few billion years ago and you find a boiling acid hot spring, you don't immediately say that's a ridiculous place. No organism would live in boiling battery acid. But instead, you turn your mind to Yellowstone and you say, well, you know, Sulfolobus lives in boiling battery acid, so it means that at least it's possible that a life form could live there, even if it doesn't actually. So it gives us this minimum envelope for life. And I know that Lynn did less than life in extreme environments, but she certainly took delight in the oddities and so on that gave us some idea of at least what was possible from our one data point here on Earth. Convergence is what gives us some confidence that it might happen again. And so this whole idea of endosymbiosis, it would be wonderful to just look at a single chloroplast or, you know, single mitochondrion and say this was this big revolutionary breakthrough in evolution, which it certainly was. But the fact is that we see endosymbiosis going on over and over and over. It's a highly convergent fact, and so it helps to give us confidence that if life starts to arise in a similar way elsewhere, endosymbiosis is actually a very clever way to pick up a new genetic complement, and that it certainly seems to be relatively easy if you look at life on Earth. And finally, the point that I made at the very beginning, and that is the whole question of life arising in a planetary context. And this is, you know, to some extent a weak Gaia sort of hypothesis. I really don't want to get into that. But the fact is that life and the physical environment are intimately entwined. You know, everything from the rise of our oxygenated atmosphere to even, I have colleagues who say that the presence of granite on the Earth is a biomarker. There are all sorts of ways that we can see clearly an interaction between us, life, and the physical environment, and obviously the reverse is true as well. And this is so critical if we're going to try to find life elsewhere, because it's those physical features that we're going to certainly see first. And so I wanted to end by saying to the other Lynn, this is how she ended her last email to me, and so I'm going to pass that back to her. Thank you very much.